This is one of the projects that we have run at the Chris Foundation. It's about the conservation value and vulnerability of amphibians in a tropical altitudinal gradient. It has to do with mountains, not so snowy as this one, quite warmer and with a lot more forest. It has to do with the conservation value of this mountain, and it has to do with the vulnerability to climate change of the species that we have found in this mountain. And obviously it has to do with frogs. So why we should do research on altitudinal gradients? First, because we know very little about how biodiversity responds to altitude and how it responds to the changes that altitude brings in temperature, humidity and other environmental factors. Second, because climate change. Climate change is going to modify how we understand biodiversity, how we understand conservation. It's going to change the rules of the game. Species are expected to shift altitudinal ranges up with global warming, but we don't know how much, at what pace, or even if it's true for all species. And at last, because altitudinal gradients are natural labs where we can test in fairly controlled situations how species are going to respond to changes in temperature, humidity, and other environmental factors that altitude changes. And why we choose amphibians to study? First, because they are very sensitive to any alteration in their habitat. They have low dispersal ability, low mobility, and very narrow ecological requirements. They are linked to specific features of the habitat, so if those change, they will react and respond very fastly. Second, because they are a highly threatened group. It is the most threatened group of vertebrates, with around 27% of species threatened with extinction. They are mainly threatened by habitat loss and habitat change, but climate change is already starting to impact them, and the effects for the future are expected to be massive for this group. For these reasons, they work as canaries in the coal mine. They're going to be one of the first groups to respond to climate change. So it's very important to understand how they are responding to altitude, to be able to understand how they are going to respond to climate change and how we can mitigate the effects of this process. Our study site is the Manu Biosphere Reserve, which is the most diverse place in the world for amphibians. In the Manu Biosphere Reserve, you can go from the highland grasslands over 4,000 meters to the lowland tropical forest. In this case, we are working in the Manu Learning Center, which is in the foothills of the Andes. Our altitudinal gradient was in the Piñi Piñi range. In this range, you can go from 400 meters to 1200 meters in less than 4 kilometers. There is also an incredible amount of amphibian species in this area. We have found more than 70. And it's also an unprotected area, which makes it even more interesting to study. This is a map of the study area. We divided the altitudinal gradient in 4 bands. The first going from 450 meters to 550 meters. The second one from 650 to 750. Third one 850 to 950, and last 1050 to 1150. So how we survey amphibians? We carry out visual encounter surveys along transects during the 2013 dry season. We installed 10 transects in each altitudinal band. Each transect was 100 meters, and it took us between 25 and 30 minutes to do one of these transects. Every individual frog or other amphibians that we're finding, it was collected, identified, and later on released. So after all that field work, what did we find? First, we started to look to things such as richness, abundance, and diversity of the community. And we find some very interesting results. First, when we looked to richness, which is nothing else than number of species, we saw a very clear decline with the altitude. Later, we analyzed the diversity, which is an index that looks to the species that you have found, the number of them, and the abundance of them. And we saw exactly the same trend, a decrease with the altitude. But in the Piñi Piñi range, there is no streams or bodies of water in the higher up areas. So these areas are very important because many different species of amphibians breed on them. For example, tree frogs or poison dart frogs. So what we did is to exclude these species that breed on these bodies of water from the analysis. And what we saw is that the decrease is not as clear as before. It seems like there's still a decrease in diversity, but not as obvious. We also looked to the beta diversity, which means how similar are the different communities in an area. And what we saw is that there is just an 8% of similarity between the lower band and the upper band. What this means is that the lower band community and the higher up band community are completely different. Finally, we look to the community structure. The way we did this is through abundance dominance graphs. In these graphs, the most abundant species have the first rank, the second most abundant the second rank, and so on. Later you fix a model into these points and it creates a slope. If this slope is very steep, it means that the community is not very complex and is dominated by a small group of species. For example, the top community, 90% of the records were 2 species. On the other hand, a less steep slope indicates a more complex community with a larger number of rare species. And what we saw here is that the structure of the communities were more complex in the lower bands than in the higher ones. With all this information, we decided to assess the vulnerability to climate change of the species that we have found in the area. We based this assessment in the altitudinal ranges of the species and the breeding habitats, classifying the species into the ones that were breeding on ponds and streams and ones that were using other microhabitats. And what we found is 2 different constraints to altitudinal shifts for amphibians. The first one, it was species found in the lowlands that breed on streams and ponds. Because of the lack of these habitats, these species will not be able to shift up because these habitats don't exist and they will not be able to reproduce. The other constraint that we found affected the species that were found only on the top of the mountain. Because the range of hills doesn't go any higher than 1300 meters, the species on the top will not have any area to shift the altitudinal ranges up. Combining these 2 constraints, 35% of the species that we have found in the area are under extreme threat by climate change. Both constraints have a similar importance. This result highlights the special vulnerability to climate change of the species that are found on the top of the mountains and they cannot shift the altitudinal ranges up, and also of the species from the lowlands that breed on ponds and streams. These species are also very close to the thermal limits, so any change in temperature, which is expected by global warming, will quite likely force them to move their ranges up, but these species will not be able to. This means that most of these species will disappear locally or suffer severe impacts in their abundances. We also found that this Piñi range has an incredible conservation value, as it is highlighted by the fact that we found potentially new species to science, like the ones that you can see in the photos, which are Nobleya species and Pristimantis species. To conclude, if we want to maximize biodiversity conservation in a climate change scenario, we need to protect the whole gradient, because this will allow 2 species to shift their altitudinal ranges as much as possible, and it will also protect the communities in the highlands, which are, as we saw before, completely different to the ones in the lowlands. And finally, I just want to give a huge thank you to everyone that helped in the fieldwork, analysis and grading up of this project, especially the Chris Foundation.